I am here at the invitation of the Chandigarh Lalit Kala Academy. My name is Alka Pande and I'm an art historian and an author, and I'm delighted to be here in Chandigarh as part of the celebrations of the 90th birthday of K.G. Subramanyan, popularly known also as Manida. What gives me greater pleasure is that my friend Naveen Kishore is here, who has been associated with Manida as long as I can remember. And what we are going to be hopefully doing today is to be having a friendly conversation, talking about a person we both admire, we both have been looking at the work, and we come from two different trajectories. Naveen as a person who has been working very closely with K.G. Subramanyan, as a person who's living in Kolkata, as a person who has lived and watched the work of Manida not only in Shantiniketan but also in Baroda, published more than 44 books of K.G. Subramanyan over a span of almost 30 years, which has been a huge kind of documentation. Naveen has worked almost as an archivist, not only in documenting the work but also in presenting the visual image making of K.G. Subramanyan. Me, on the other hand, has had a much, I should say, a marginal or a peripheral role, but you know how it is, peripheries become the center becomes the margins. So I think today we are going to be having a lot of fun doing border crossings, cultural crossings, and hoping to have, for both of us, an insightful conversation on K.G. Subramanyan, coming from two different worlds, a world which is inhabited in the personal space of Manida by Naveen Kishore, me from a more distant critical world where I have read a lot of his works, having met him in Shantiniketan many years ago, but always been in touch with him through a lot of his exhibitions which I have seen in New Delhi. So Naveen, tell me, what is your, how do you kind of place yourself in Manida's world? And what do you think of him as a person, as an artist? Because I think perhaps in the non-art world, you would probably be somebody who's been closest to him.
Well, it goes back a long time to start with, about 30 years. We just started to publish our books, which in itself was interesting because we came into publisher overnight, especially me, from a theatre design background. And so you went from one space of the theatre with, at that point, the sort of cockiness of youth of a certain kind, where you felt you could walk into any space and make something of it. And you plunged overnight, for various reasons, into publishing, but publishing in the arts. Arts again defined as theatre, slightly off the beaten track, and film and fine art, not the usual coffee table. And being in Calcutta, it was the first time I went to Shantiniketan was in '83, through a mentoring editorial presence of a man called Shamik Banerjee, who was Seagull's first editor. And the pilgrimage was to meet K.G. Subramanyan and Somnath Aur.
Okay.
And both with a view to ask them, but with his writing. And I remember meeting him and Sushila Di. He was married to this wonderful Punjabi woman, 4 years older than him, who spoke Punjabi with me and made sure that we had rajmas for every meal that we landed up there. And the first time we met him, it was interesting because he was dealing with two people, of which one he sort of knew, Shamik, because he was an art critic and scholar. The other one, a young person who was starting life in publishing, and he said yes to a collection of essays which were later published as Living Tradition, and which came out within, because you know we were building a list, so you'd worked very quickly, and within a year you had published this book, which was then launched at Shantiniketan and so on and so forth. So, very briefly, one came to this already fairly immense personality even then through publishing. And during the course of discovering and working and producing this published book, you started to see things around him. He would take you up to his studio at Chandigarh and you would start to see the art. And I was just discovering my discovery of art started with an exhibition of Chitravanu's work, literally. Mm-hmm. That was the first thing I ever did. You saw his work. So it was natural that the next thing I would do was to say, Manida, may I show your work? And this is typical of the man, which we will come to, I hope, in the course of our discussion. He said, huh? Karo, and when? And this is interesting because if you jump back and forth in this guy's life, you find that he is so committed in the nicest possible way to what I call the gallery system. Good, bad, indifference, fly by night, or serious, or whatever, if you approach him in the right way, he will let you exhibit or show his work. Often there have been times when people haven't done justice to this showing in various ways, and yet he is not tied to one particular contracted, agreed upon arrangement with a gallery the way we know it in the West or are beginning to now know it here. He's also, in many ways, I find that he's outside the system. He is not promoted formally either by an auction house or an art gallery or individuals. It's all about his relationships with both the work that he does and those that take it to a public space.
Do you think it's a deliberate move on his part to be outside the system?
I don't think it's strategy. I think it's just, if you look at when they started, and for the longest time, him and his contemporaries, nobody was really selling and everything stayed at home. So, when you were showing them, you had such a plethora and a vast treasure house of years and years and years of work that you could actually sift and curate through and put up, which was, wonderful, because it was just there. So I think it was a kind of instinctive, natural way of, and I think it goes back to his having studied under the Tagores and the Vinod Biharis. There was a kind of inclusive thing where you just worked with people, and which meant, of course, you would get upset with them and they would get upset with you, which also meant that sometimes they would let you down as you would let them down. But there was no exclusivity to something that was being put into the public domain. And if you, again, jump into our contemporary technology today, everybody's so paranoid about putting anything on the net with watermarks. And once it's out there, it's out there. And I think some of it has to do with his own training and upbringing and the kind of teachers and mentors that, the Vinod Biharis and the Nandlal Boses, so on and so forth. And so I mean, I think the relationship with, this is very much a Segal thing. So, I mean, again, retrospectively, when one looks back at these things, it's just, it's us. We relate to each other. We may not meet that often, but you get on. And that's how it is.
Can I interrupt?
Sure.
You use this nice word called retrospective. Mm-hmm. Now, as a person, I would in some ways call you his curator too, perhaps, because you've been seeing his work for 30 years. When would you say was his first official showing, which he did? And what would be is there a kind of development of materials in his work? When he showed first, did he show as a painter or a draftsman with his pen and ink sketches? So is there some kind of a structure to his showing to the public at large? And when did he show first?
I think there are 2-3 things here. One is, you have to remember that even now, with all due respect, the word curator is kind of heavily loaded against a certain kind of lay understanding of the word. Mm-hmm. What is it that you, as Alka Pande, will do in curating a show? Mm-hmm. And what is it that I, as a new entrant into something, will curate by saying कि भाई 2 tasveerein aap Krishna ke theme pe kar do, curate ho gaya. That it's, you know, it's kind of thing that's been happening. So I would hesitate, yeah, I understand what you're saying, but I would hesitate to call myself a curator in that sense. But I would be perfectly comfortable with the fact that I've been watching, not necessarily from as early on as I would have liked to, being a much younger person than him. When I came, for example, when I came into his life, he wasn't doing enough terracotta. So all that had happened. The material had changed because glass was now acrylic, the tradition of reverse painting. So I did not see, I mean, you know, I would have to go to people's houses to see the odd gifted glass painting, you know, or Alkazi Saab or the NGMA and so on and so forth. So, I mean, obviously all of this began with painting, but a man who, and this Ghulam Sheikh says it very, very articulately whenever I've heard him talk about Manida, is that this is a man who is very deft with the craft of his, the physicality of his hands. He uses his hands like that's his mind. It's a complete, you know, he can do anything. He'll make little toys out of something or shape something into something and cut something up, you know, doing it himself.
So the book, which is called The Magic of Making,
Sure.
Would that be, you know, kind of a USP or a definer of Manida? Because now today you have, there is another book called The Art of Not Making, and what you have today, the Duchampian legacy, which probably one of our iconic, most commercially successful artists, Subodh Gupta and others of his generation do, which is they don't really make anymore with their hands. They have these huge studios, or they have these huge workshops where people actually, they have the idea, they draw it, and they get somebody else to execute it. So would that be part of that generation, or would it be specifically of Manida, that he was a person who kind of was very true to the art of making or the magic of making, which he believed in? Is that how you would define the man?
Yeah, to a great degree, yes. I would even go further to say that I would like to keep using the word craft, either in brackets or without, every time you associate with this man. I mean, let's not forget the whole handloom legacy, the Populje careers, all of that stuff that he did work to them. But this is a man who actually respects craftsmen, the craft, traditional. He's also the kind of person who's not afraid of what you and I loosely call the contemporary. By contemporary, I would mean everything from computer technology to 20 carpenters working on a woodblock something because the artist is now working in that sphere, or Subodh's example of, you know, putting the sort of technology of putting together a monster made out of steel or whatever. His only concern, or his only sharp criticism, as and when it happens, is ultimately it has to get across, it has to resonate, it has to hit you without, you know, 3 volumes of articulation around it. It has to, of course people will read and write, that's how it is, but the first thing that has to happen is that it has to be able to work for you. He's very comfortable in lots of medium. You know, I mean, he's worked at just about everything from ceramics and terracotta and wooden toys and fabric and wire and metal and bronze and of course acrylic and glass paintings, gouaches on board, and he's constantly doing this. He's also very amenable to ideas. He is not a reclusive, secretive being who, if you happen to be watching or shooting or photographing him at work, gets into a state of despair, gets engrossed in doing it. He's articulate about it, but it's you can't say it enough. His ability, his command of a different material, and even now at age 90, my version of this is when I look at this new work, which is not necessarily as, I call it, dense as some of the earlier stuff we have in our collection or the earlier exhibition. Because he's working within what I think is, there's a kind of physical thing now, whether it's hip replacements or a certain age or whatever. And it's wonderful how interestingly and cleverly he manages to do it in formats which are comfortable. If they're too big, perhaps they may be more sparse. If they're smaller, where he can sit and work, they may get more dense. But the joy of this whole making, if not just the magic of it, is very much there. You can see it there. You may have preferences of saying, oh, I preferred that work, oh, but this one perhaps is different, it's not working for me as much as that. Because you've got a prolific artist, of course you're going to do that, and that is welcomed. And you have the, if you're lucky, you can discuss this with him, and he's open and game. But he's also a man whose dailiness is influenced by just about everything. It's like in the days when you and I have discovered that travel around the world for some of us was free-flowing. So we were open to all kinds of influences and not just insulated to either the library books that told us how Martha Graham was designing stages, so whether I could take the odd tip or not, we could actually see Martha Graham at work. So, so here's a man who's watching his TV, he's got radio coming at him, advertising. In any conversation, you have to be on your toes because he's references from popular film to culture to some poster at a panwala's dukaan where he's found time to see that. And all of that does find its way into the myth-making of his work.
Well, you've used very interesting things, and there are so many questions which are coming to my mind. First, of course, to go backwards from this little conversation, in some ways he's a polymath. There are no two ways about that. He's an educator, he's a maker, he's a commentator, he's concerned about issues of modernity, contemporaneity. But I want to begin with this, what in today's parlance or in a modernistic language, the bad word is craft. So if you are a fine artist, you don't do craft. And this big division which was there in modernistic times, that craft is not art and fine art that will not look at craft. So that is one question. The second thing you used, which was very, very interesting, was the point of when you said two words like interesting and clever. So when you say that he was a crafty man, the interesting and cleverness which comes into it, does it in any way dilute his art as a visual artist? And or does it make him more Indian?
Well, first of all, crafty and the love of craft is completely different. Because crafty has a kind of machination, a sort of premeditated cunning to it. His love for the craft, very simply the word craft as I use it in my interpretation of how he works, is quote unquote doing. Doing that is different, it's sort of hands-on doing with material that has a tactility and can be shaped into something else other than that on the wall as a painting and so on and so forth. It's a very simplistic interpretation of it. But that carried to the traditional, the respect for the artisans, the craftsmen of this vast land of ours, is what inspires, right? And when somebody like him is inspired, it's not a quickie American theatre director coming for 2 months and working on the Ram Leela and going back and turning out something glamorous or exciting. It is a lifelong practice and imbibing of those crafts, which then appear artistically or through the medium of his well-formed sense of art history, all of the education and his own ability to sort of take it in and churn it and make it his own. And the interesting and the clever, again, are words, as far as I am concerned, where one, the word interesting is my sense of how wonderfully marvelous that he has found a solution. Two, what physically, when Ashomnath, after a while, because of his lungs, couldn't work with bronze, so he filled in notebooks. This man has worked around that, whatever disabilities a hip replacement gives you, to turn something like War of the Relics out in 2 weeks. He works with a limitation, where he decides that if it's going to be 36 by 9 feet, because that's the wall, then I'm going to do this in panels of 4.5 feet. But in that sense, I mean cleverness.
So he works more like a designer.
So clever and interesting is, oh yes, absolutely. Design, handloom, there's a whole connection. What I'm trying to say is that those words imply a certain problem solving, the ability to improvise. You walk into a situation and say, okay, so this is what I can do, let's do it. So that implies, with my theatre background, a kind of high compliment that this man is a theatre person. To me, a theatre person doesn't necessarily have to be somebody who's been on stage, but a way of life.
So is it the act of performance a part of KG's work?
I think so. I mean, if you look at even this work, those wonderful women we call goddesses, they are performing all kinds of things, from sacrifices and beheadings to, all kinds of environmental things. But yes, I think it wouldn't be incorrect to the strong sense of he is influenced by a lot of folk performances. Even today, when we were asking about where he was born, and he talked about the dance thing. It was interesting. But
so, any particular folk performances that you know that he is particularly fond of?
All of the sort of. I know that the classical forms he's very familiar with. He can watch a Bharatanatyam performance, and you know that he's keeping tab of not just the music, but he knows exactly what's happening. His daughter Ruma was trained as a dancer too. I know that all the sort of Kodiyatams of the world, and he's seen them all. He's done his Kathakalis. He's actually been to all these places. He's seen it, and it finds its way.
He's lived in three, or I wouldn't say lived, but he belongs to three important culturally rich states: Kerala, Gujarat, and West Bengal. So from Baul to the folk forms of Gujarat, to Kerala, from the Sopana music there. Has he trained in any of these dance forms? Personally?
No.
He's just a keen observer.
That's right, yeah. And
so
he's actually hugely perfect, because he's hugely fond of the arts, which is why whenever we've after a while, one sort of celebrates a certain presence. So whether it was his 75th birthday, or his 80th, or his 85th, and now his 90th, music has kind of followed these traveling exhibitions. I've always begun in Baroda. We had Uday Bavalkar. In Shantiniketan for his 75th, we had a whole bunch of people from Shahid Parvez, Under the Trees, to the Mysore Brothers. And, so there's a kind of, it's our gift to him, so that because he's the person in the audience you're catering to for that particular thing, because he enjoys the music. And he knows the music. He knows new people. He knows, of course, the masters. He has opinions on them. It's really quite a thing that someone who is at an age where he is perfectly comfortable at ease, that every day, it's every day, one day at a time.
You've taken names of artists and musicians from Shahid Parvez to the Mysore Brothers. They're very eclectic in their spirit, and I was reading from a lot of his work that he believes in the spirit of eclecticism. So how do you define his eclecticism?
Oh God, here's a man who's been to jail from for the freedom movement to, it's such a vast oeuvre. It comes out in when he's writing to a human resource minister for when he's been asked his comment on public art. He has opinions on art education, for example. And the interesting thing about him, from what I call a certain kind of contemporary critic, and I deliberately this time use the word critic slightly sharply, is that he offers a detailed map, a solution. So if, it's like if you walk into a space and you rip apart 30 of my life's designs, and which, by the way, he's done, that's a different story. And you do it, and you're marvelously articulate, you completely, and even I have to agree that what you're saying is true, but you're not offering me a solution. Now you can say, this is not my task, honey, I'm not going to offer you a solution. But when a government approaches you to comment or be part of, say, a committee of something. And at that moment, you bring in your entire life, which you've rehearsed wonderfully well for that particular moment. And you say, okay, so you are scathing about why it shouldn't happen. And then you say, this is how it could happen. And then it's met with silence, because it is not easy for governments to necessarily jump to it, though sometimes it's possible for them to be able to do it. And this is also true when young people ask him in situations like this, when he's being interviewed on stage for one of our events. Somebody, young person from the student from Chandigarh said, how long does it take you to do this painting? And this is a question that keeps coming up. And he just snaps his fingers and he says that, it's that particular moment where my entire life comes into that particular meaning something, and then it happens like that. It doesn't wait I don't go back to it for 6 days or 8 days or all of that sort of stuff. And at the same time, this is a man who has reasonable self-mocking ability to say, when someone like Ina asks him on a Doordarshan interview, okay, bhai, you're surrounded by, look at this work all in 1 year, Manida, He says, well, there's 365 days in a year. The kind of work I am doing today, I can do one a day, but that would be trite, wouldn't it? So, there's a kind of, so for a person...
Sardonic humor as well.
So there's a person like that who's at ease across age groups, across economic strata, all kinds of stuff. So he's obviously, he's not only eclectic and renaissance and all those wonderful words that we use for people we revere in the nicest possible way. He's not really part of, sometimes people, tend to label groups of this, that. He has opinions. So you can then look at 10 such opinions and say, oh, he belongs to this school, etc., etc., etc. But as a practicing human being, where you live your dailiness in your love for people, environment, your art, etc., 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 and you do the best you can by them.
Well, he's one of the few living artists who was born much before the independence of the country.
Yeah, it's part of it.
He's seen the independence, he's seen modernity, he's seen what we call now the contemporary. How would you kind of see the patterns? Let me begin by asking you, what does modernity mean to you? And when does modernity start for you? And where do you locate Manida in that modernity?
See, this is a difficult one for an untrained mind such as mine, because there is a kind of, for me, even looking and viewing and, I guess in retrospect, studying a certain kind of art, if we locate our sense of the modern in terms of the contemporary Indian art, all of it, in any case, in terms of awareness and our ability to even see stuff, ends up being after our independence in a certain kind of way. And I'm talking of, if you're trying to locate a Manida or a Hussain Saab at one level, I sort of see them as extremes, but both wonderful showmen and performing artists in their own way. So I'm also kind of, to me, a certain kind of modernity is prevalent even today in an age which people say has moved. There has been an end to it, there's a kind of post-modernity, and now we've moved beyond that. And to me, it's one big continuous flow, of which he's a part of, in the sense that he has the ability to recall something by way of a symbol, which then appears somewhere, and it just upsets, just when you've tried to date the man and say that he was doing this as part of this school or part of this movement, and he kind of makes you, think, oh, hang on, this is not quite it. Just when you pin down the influence and say, okay, these guys are seen traditionally as part of our modern period, and you say, oh, but this guy is jumping, he's crossing the fence that has been set or defined by us as trained readers or academics, or the ones that fix time periods, because we also have to study and communicate this to a whole, a future and so on and so forth. So I don't see the labeling of this person's work is a tricky one, except when we need to do it for convenience and study. And so many phases. Look at the different kinds.
But we were talking. You mentioned Hussain Saab. Now, one of the things is that most of his contemporaries, whether it is a Hussain or a Raza or a Souza or a Kishan Khanna, they were what was called part of the progressives.
Sure.
So how come Manida, was it a deliberate act that he was not part of that big kind of Bombay progressives or just the progressives? Was it a deliberate act or what happened, or because he's very much part of that generation?
Sure, he's definitely part of that generation, and a respectful part, interestingly, in the sense that one has some of those people one has heard being hugely warm and complimentary. But I don't see it as a deliberated thing. It could just be the circumstance of something very simple and boring, like the geography. 30 years in Baroda, 23 years in Shantiniketan, and so he's actually, this is the first time he's going to be showing in Kerala, for example. So even that third state where it's just the accident of birth in a sense, and a certain influence, of course, he keeps, but I don't know. I think this is a question that we need to put to him, and we just see if Gautam managed to do that in his film, which we hope will be screened shortly. But I wouldn't be qualified to answer on his behalf in terms of whether it was. My reading of it is that he is the kind of person who would not want to, quote unquote, be part of something except historically. So it's that retrospective logic, it's even just to very briefly, which can be edited out, which is that after 40 years of a certain kind of publishing and way of being in a Seagull's thing, there are pockets of a certain kind of business school, whether it's in Oslo or Iowa or in Ahmedabad, who are curious and wanting to study what they see as an intuitive way of being a structure that looks like it's not a structure, and are studying the Seagull way of. I said, nonsense. It's complete retrospective method that you guys are reading into it. It's the logic of survival, which is as ancient. You go, you unveil, you solve problems. You go, you unveil, you solve problems. You carry on, and which is what often happens in the arts or in literature, where it's kind of an onion peeling thing often. The labeling is somebody else's task, and a welcome task. It's not a problem. So if somebody at some point will place him, understandably, in a particular phase, that's fine. But whether we can pin him down in a conversation to that remains to be seen.
No, because as an art historian, for me, it's just, I was just...
And he's an art historian himself, so it'd be interesting. It's a very relevant question. And even the art historian part of him, he's hugely lucid, and lucid and often in a raw kind of way. It's stuff that you can criticize often, and you can. Some people would be able to. It's not the academia or the rigor of certainty. It is the passion of a thought process that is wanting to be vomited out and shared quickly.
I'm going to surprise you with one question and immediately ask for your response.
Me? Oh God.
What is your favorite medium of his?
For his? Definitely the acrylic reverse paintings for me. And my only regret, if such a thing is possible for me who claims that I don't have regrets, is I desperately covet his terracottas, which I wish one would have. So
is that your favorite?
No, but the whimsy of those is very, very, to be able to do that in a medium which is perhaps more difficult than the reverse acrylic, to be able to get the humor, the satire, the wit, the whimsy of, in that material is what I haven't seen enough of the damn things, That's the other thing. There is no public space for being able to share and show to a citizenship that wants to see this.
Because they're so delicate to carry.
No, because where are they? They're either in private collections or they're in the odd NGMA type place who do not genuinely have the resources to keep exhibiting one person's work, And we're not a culture at this moment in our lives where we can dedicate 3 rooms to Alka and 4 rooms to, so and so and fine. So it's going to be left for a different time when some of these people will be shown in a certain way, curated in a certain way for later generations.
Does he have any particular favorites of his work or material? Does he like to work in a particular, is he more comfortable in a particular medium? Because I see that he, from pen and ink to paper cutting to reverse paintings to terracotta to wooden toys.
Oh, all of it. I mean, some of it he doesn't do any longer because it's the kind of laboriousness of the terracotta is difficult. But the pen and ink stuff, and even now these gouaches on board the exhibition, this is a dailiness where he sits where you're sitting and the table is full of these, treated white boards. And he's working. This is, between feeling drowsy and he's complaining of a certain drowsiness now. And so that's how it is. It's. I don't think there's a kind of favorite thing here. He's doing all of these 6, 7 things. At the moment, even as we speak, the drawing room is like some 20-foot set of paintings he's doing for somebody. Canvases, big ones. He's working on these. We've got this 4-foot diameter acrylic sheets, and so that becomes a challenge, that how is perspective going to work for her when she sees it from that side of the tabletop to me to this side, or is it good? So he's excited and he doesn't say no, and when it looks like he has to work around it, for example, in the same quote-unquote rubbish heap where I found these diameters, I found 8 by 2 feet panels, 6 of them. Now, knowing that this was going to be tricky to handle, but it is his decision. I sent them to him as they were, and he said, "Naveen, wo shayad kaatne padenge." I said, "Yeah, do what you want or not,
It's not a nice question. Talking money is never a comfortable thing for anybody. But in today's day and age, where even the art world is becoming more defined by commercial success, how much of commerce matters to Manida? I know I should be asking him this question, but I'm just doing it in a roundabout way. That how important is it for him to be valued commercially? Because that's an important thing in today's world. And how does he kind of, if it's going to a public collection, if he's being commissioned, does it all depend on who's commissioning him? How important are commissions for him? How important is it for him to have his freedom to work? And does he demand now a kind of a payment in cash or kind?
No, I don't think he demands. What he does, I know, is with my sense of it is that and this is connected to what we said earlier, he has always been outside, I like to call it the marketplace. In other words, that the market has made it its duty, understandably often on its own terms, to find its way to him. Because those of us who lead the market or sell and buy and trade and make opinion about pricing and who should buy what, he's at one level accessible to all of us players if we wish to be, except that we are all very possessive about him, so we want exclusivity. As a result, none of us actually get him enough. So he's outside it, and therefore very much an artist that collectors either want or don't want. I don't think what happens with a situation like that is that your price doesn't do the Subodh trajectory perhaps, or even the Hussain Saab trajectory in a hurry. Probably take 50, 70, 80 years, and time will tell, we hope. So I find that his prices therefore are, for a buying elite, much more reasonable compared to most of his contemporaries.
Is it because he's so prolific?
It's a combination of the fact that he's prolific and the fact that all of us so-called buying, collecting, appreciating people are now depending, whether you like it or not, on the reality of saffron benchmarks. Oh, it's went for this much, so we start our argument at that level. Whereas that's not the way it works. I've also discovered through the sheer practice that if you hold on to the prices long enough because you think they are fair, there's been no change in his prices since 2004 when we were exhibiting him. We haven't sort of systematically taken them up. His answer to the marketplace was an interesting one, that there was one big boom time when of about, let us say, 132 works we traveled for his 75th birthday. We sold 112, and then for his 80th birthday we sold nothing. And people were saying, no, but bring the prices down, this is what the reality is. And his thing was, these are not orphan children. I'm painting so much, I have enough space. Besides, you guys were the ones who decided on these prices and you were making merry as galleries. Today, you're in trouble not being able to sell them at those prices. Sell them at those prices in these times of recession and prove your worth. Don't get me involved in all this. Why should I lower my prices, which were not set by me in any case? So, there is, the reality is that we all need, we can't grudge these guys their so-called market share or monies, because till 89, 90, everybody kept their works at home. There was nothing selling. And then there was one boom when you and I started turning our drawing rooms into galleries. And then there was the down thing. Then there was another big boom that lasted for a while. And then again, this whole thing. Now it's become fairly rationalized. I think it's on the kind of upswing, but a nice level where there is, I think there's more reality to. In the context of the rest of the world, Indian market prices are rubbish. They don't compare. If you lumped the entire thing together, it would make any sense to anybody. It's not but my sense is that he is perfectly realistically aware of the marketplace, but all his comments, including the books that you will read, and in fact the catalogue of the thing, actually says one or two things that will answer you aptly about the fact that, it's not about the marketplace. Even such a show that I'm traveling around, he's on record in his Doordarshan interview saying that nobody else would do it, because you would want to immediately sell and get on with it, but to go show. Now you can tell me that that's great strategy, because the next 20 years, the towns like this that have seen it, somebody may develop a taste for it. But when you're practicing these things, they are not strategies for you. They are a combination of inspiration, excitement over somebody's work, and the fact that at a particular time, you're the conduit through which something is getting shown. Kal ko koi aur dikhayega.
I just want to round up our conversation by asking you, would you call him a blue chip artist?
A blue chip artist? Sweet. Yes, I've always found him a blue chip artist.
So he would go down in history?
He would go down in history, blue or green or whatever. He would. He has gone down in history.
He has a place of his own.
He has a place of his own for various things, And as I said, there's enough work to like and dislike and discuss and commentate and criticize and get inspired with. So it's such a vast body, and it's continuing. Some people find the prolific a negative thing, which it might well be, who knows, but it is a compulsion. You wake up and you start to do. This is what you do. So some of us just wake up and start writing, some of us want to paint, some of us want to go and work at a particular job. It's possible, but to me it's a sign of being live in a certain kind of way, mentally, physically, all of that. And, blessing the dailiness, so celebrating the dailiness.
Thank you very much, Naveen. It's
Thank
been
you.
a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.